The year is 1988. RAF Binbrook, Lincolnshire. Flat farmland, North Sea wind cutting sideways across the runways, grey overcast that barely lifts. A pilot from 5 Squadron walks out to his English electric Lightning, an interceptor that first entered RAF service in 1959 and can climb vertically past Mach 2. Recessed into the belly weapon stations beneath the fuselage sit 2 missiles. One is Red Top, entering service in the early 1960s to engage Soviet bombers from any angle of approach, head-on, from the beam, from below. The other is Firestreak, a tail-chase infrared weapon whose seeker was designed before British food rationing ended in 1954. Both missiles on the same aircraft. One pilot responsible for stopping nuclear bombers before they reached London. Red Top was built specifically to make Firestreak obsolete. De Havilland Propellers designed it with all-aspect engagement capability, a larger warhead, wider gimbal angles on the seeker, and speeds reaching Mach 3. By every measurable standard, it outperformed the weapon it was meant to replace. But mounted on the Lightning's belly, a tight, aerodynamically sensitive space on an aircraft already at the limits of single-seat interceptor design, Red Top introduced stability problems that were never fully resolved. Instead of completing the transition, the RAF hedged. For over 2 decades, Britain's primary interceptor carried both generations of missile simultaneously. And the engineers who designed the older weapon watched their creation outlast every white paper, every committee, and every procurement plan that tried to retire it. Red Top's existence was driven by a single operational constraint that haunted Firestreak from the day it entered service. Firestreak, originally classified under the Rainbow Code Blue Jay, could only attack from behind. Its infrared seeker locked onto the hot exhaust plume of an enemy aircraft, which forced the interceptor pilot to maneuver into a rear hemisphere position, behind and below his target, before he could fire. Against a Soviet bomber flying straight and level, that geometry was achievable. Against one that started turning, the requirement to get behind the target before shooting could cost the pilot the seconds he didn't have. De Havilland Propellers received the Firestreak development contract in 1952 and delivered a weapon that entered operational service in 1957 to 1958, initially on the Gloucester Javelin, then, more consequentially, on the Lightning. The seeker drew on infrared homing principles captured from German wartime research. De Havilland employed German scientists during years 1951 to 1953, when Firestreak, then known as Blue Jay, was in the early stages of development. These specialists had worked on Luftwaffe infrared programs under designations like Kielgerät, pronounced Kielgerät with a hard G. From those foundations, the de Havilland team built a seeker that could detect a jet engine's heat signature from miles away, lock on, and guide a missile to intercept at closing speeds that would have been inconceivable a decade earlier. Firestreak's warhead released over 1,000 preformed fragments in a 50-degree forward-biased cone, enough to shred a bomber's airframe in a fraction of a second, and the weapon would self-destruct after approximately 13 seconds if no intercept occurred. Formidable by 1950s standards. But the tail chase limitation was baked into the physics. Red Top existed because that limitation had to go. Development began under the designation Blue Jay Mark II in the late 1950s, while Firestreak was still entering squadron service. De Havilland Propellers, the same division, many of the same engineers, set out to build a weapon that broke the rear hemisphere constraint entirely. Red Top's seeker was the key. Where Firestreak's optics could only track the concentrated heat of an exhaust plume viewed from directly behind, Red Top featured wider gimbal angles and substantially greater sensitivity. Its seeker could detect and track aircraft from the front hemisphere, from beam on, from virtually any angle of approach. All-aspect engagement wasn't a marginal improvement. It was a fundamental change in what an interceptor pilot could do. A Lightning armed with Firestreak had to spend precious seconds setting up a tail chase. A Lightning armed with Red Top could kill a target flying straight at him. Performance gains extended beyond the Seeker. Red Top reached Mach 3, significantly outpacing Firestreak. Its warhead was larger and more destructive. The lethal envelope, the volume of sky within which the missile could successfully engage, expanded in every direction. De Havilland's engineers had taken the lessons from Firestreak and applied them to a weapon that solved the predecessor's most dangerous shortcoming. The RAF accepted Red Top as a phased replacement for Firestreak, with the expectation of a progressive transition. Stocks would build up, integration would be certified across the Lightning fleet, and the older missile would withdraw from service within a few years. In 1960, no one anticipated that both weapons would still share belly stations on the same aircraft 3 decades later. The word phased was supposed to describe a brief overlap. Instead, it described an era. Before Red Top could mature into that role, the political ground beneath British defence shifted in a way that would warp procurement for a generation. On April 4, 1957, Duncan Sandys, the Minister of Defence, published the 1957 Defence White Paper. Its central thesis arrived with absolute confidence. Manned fighter aircraft were obsolete. Surface-to-air missiles launched from the ground, weapons like Bloodhound and Thunderbird, would replace interceptors entirely. No new manned fighters would follow the Lightning, which was already too far along to cancel. An entire generation of aircraft designers, engine builders and weapons engineers learned from a single policy document that their expertise was surplus to requirements. Red Top survived the White Paper, though the missiles Sandys envisioned were ground-launched Bloodhounds and Thunderbirds, not air-launched weapons carried by the manned fighters he considered obsolete. But a more capable de Havilland weapon didn't. Red Dean, a larger, more sophisticated air-to-air missile, with greater range and a more advanced guidance system, was well into development when the White Paper killed it. Sandys' reasoning, if it deserves the word, was that manned fighters had no future, and the weapons they carried had no future with them. A missile program cancelled in a document that championed missiles. Just not that kind. Red Dean's death eliminated an upgrade path that could have given the RAF a weapon capable enough to replace Firestreak cleanly, years before the gap became chronic. What survived was Red Top, a genuine improvement over Firestreak, superior in every specification, but now carrying the weight of being the only option after something better had been deliberately destroyed. Collateral damage from the White Paper went further than individual programs. Across British aerospace, engineers whose projects had been cancelled started leaving the country. American defence firms and technology companies were hiring aggressively, and they wanted precisely the expertise Britain was discarding. Guidance specialists, aerodynamicists, electronics engineers, whose work on infrared and radar systems translated directly into booming fields like semiconductors and computing. The brain drain that followed 1957 stripped the British missile industry of talent it couldn't afford to lose. Programs left behind, Red Top among them, continued with smaller teams carrying heavier workloads. Red Top's development didn't stop, but it lost people, lost momentum, and lost institutional support at the worst possible moment in its life cycle. Red Top entered RAF service in the early 1960s, and the initial phase of deployment looked exactly like the plan said it should. Squadrons began receiving the new weapon. Firestreak was supposed to withdraw gradually into stores, then surplus, then museums. For a short period, the transition proceeded on schedule, and the future appeared to be arriving on time. Then pilots started flying full combat profiles, with red top loaded across the speed and altitude envelope where the Lightning actually operated, and the flaw emerged. Red top was physically larger than Firestreak, with bigger control surfaces and a different weight distribution. The Lightning carried its missiles in belly-recessed weapon stations, not under the wings, but underneath the fuselage, a tight, aerodynamically sensitive location on an aircraft already pushing the boundaries of what a single-seat interceptor could do. And Red top hung differently. With de Havilland's newer missile mounted, airflow around the fuselage changed. Handling characteristics shifted in measurable ways. Some accounts from the period describe problems at specific speed ranges. Others describe degraded control during high-G maneuvering. A particularly dangerous issue involved asymmetric loading. When one red top was fired, the remaining missile created an imbalance that could be dangerous at high speed. Engineering documentation that might detail exactly which flight regimes were affected and which maneuvers became marginal remains frustratingly sparse in the public record. But the operational result is beyond dispute. Red top couldn't replace Firestreak one-for-one across the Lightning fleet. The integration was never completed. A functional procurement system would have identified the specific aerodynamic and loading problems, funded the engineering work to resolve them, and finished the transition. Aerodynamic modifications to the missile or the airframe, revised firing sequences, minor redesigns of the belly stations – these were solvable problems. Red top's stability issues on the Lightning weren't unsolvable. They were unsolved, a distinction that falls on the institution rather than the engineers. The Lightning was, according to the 1957 White Paper, the last manned interceptor Britain would ever build. Investing heavily in perfecting a missile for an aircraft the government considered a dead-end technology contradicted the policy supposedly guiding national defence strategy. Red top integration work stalled, not dramatically, not through a formal cancellation order, but through underfunding and deferred decisions and the quiet bureaucratic assumption that someone else would deal with it later. Nobody dealt with it later. Both missiles stayed. Lightning squadrons carried red tops where the aircraft configuration permitted and Firestreaks where operational reality dictated. Individual aircraft increasingly flew with one of each. A red top on one station, a Firestreak on the other, giving the pilot all-aspect capability on one rail and proven tail-chase reliability on the other. Lightning pilots who served at Binbrook in the 1980s have confirmed this arrangement persisted until the aircraft's retirement in the summer of 1988. A man climbing into his cockpit for a quick reaction alert scramble would look down at two missiles from two different decades. The older, designed when Churchill was still Prime Minister. The compromise was never officially described as a failure. Years of repetition absorbed it into standard operating procedure, until the expectation that Britain's frontline interceptor should carry matching weapons became the unusual position. The system didn't fix the problem. It reclassified the problem as doctrine. During quick reaction alert, the standing order requiring interceptors airborne within minutes of a radar contact, the last barrier between Soviet bomber formations and the British mainland, Lightning pilots scrambled with a weapons suite that constrained their tactical options depending on which rail they fired from. One station offered engagement from any direction. The other demanded the pilot get behind his target first. Against a Tupolev Tu-95 Bear on a reconnaissance probe along the North Sea, that asymmetry might not matter. The intercept geometry was predictable enough. Against a genuine inbound attack, with decisions measured in seconds, carrying two different weapons with two different engagement envelopes on the same aircraft, was a liability no pilot would have chosen. It was a liability imposed by a procurement system that hadn't completed its homework in the early 1960s and never went back to finish. Behind the institutional dysfunction were individuals whose work deserved far better than the system provided. The infrared seeker at Firestreak's heart, the component red top was purpose-built to make redundant, and couldn't, was designed by a physicist named Colin Hempstead. His name appears in no popular Cold War histories. No documentary has profiled him. But the infrared eye he created sat at the nose of every Firestreak the Royal Air Force carried from the late 1950s through 1988, guiding Britain's air defence across 3 full decades. Hempstead's seeker outlasted all of it. His later career makes the achievement sting. Hempstead left aerospace entirely and became a history teacher at Teesside Polytechnic, spending years writing about the history of technology from the perspective of a man who'd quietly helped make some of it. A physicist brilliant enough to build an infrared seeker that outlived every policy and every replacement missile intended to supersede it, teaching undergraduates in the northeast of England. Most of his students had no idea their lecturer once designed a component of Britain's nuclear defence. If any of his former students or colleagues can fill in the details, that story deserves a fuller telling than it has received. At the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Bedford, an engineer named Sam Kidd kept Firestreak seekers operational through methods that belonged in workshop folklore more than any procurement file. Kidd built passive landing infrared emitters, devices for testing and calibrating the missile's seeker head, out of incandescent light bulbs painted black. Ordinary bulbs, coated to modify their emission characteristics, simulating the infrared signatures Firestreak would encounter in combat. His technique worked well enough to keep the testing program functional, well enough to validate seekers that remained in frontline service for decades. Kidd was operating in peacetime British defence, where one engineer's resourcefulness compensated for budgets that couldn't keep pace with operational demands. One family account pushes the connection even further. A viewer of the original Firestreak video has reported that their father worked on Firestreak's guidance systems, likely the infrared seeker electronics, before emigrating to the United States and joining what the family describes as the Texas Four, a group involved in designing the first microchip. The term doesn't appear widely in published semiconductor histories, and the claim hasn't been independently verified. But the plausibility is substantial. Jack Kilby demonstrated the integrated circuit at Texas Instruments in 1958. The post-white paper brain drain was sending exactly this kind of expertise: miniaturized electronics, guidance circuitry, precision engineering, across the Atlantic throughout the late 1950s and 1960s. A guidance engineer from Hatfield carrying that knowledge to Dallas, where it fed the birth of the semiconductor age, fits the documented pattern of talent transfer perfectly. Independent corroboration would make it one of the most remarkable footnotes in the history of technology. Pull back from the individual stories and look at the weapons these people produced, and another dimension emerges. Line up the British Cold War missile family: Bloodhound, Thunderbird, Sea Slug, Seacat, Firestreak, Red Top, and they share a visual identity so strong it amounts to a national design language. Large fins and distinctive nose profiles, proportions that someone once described with perfect economy as looking like what you'd draw if asked to draw a missile. And Firestreak was perhaps the most archetypally missile-shaped of them all, a weapon that could have been drawn by a child and still be immediately recognizable. Fairy Aviation built Fireflash, the beam-riding predecessor. De Havilland Propellers built both Firestreak and Red Top. The corporate lineage runs from de Havilland Propellers through Hawker Siddeley Dynamics and into British Aerospace Dynamics, mergers and reorganisations that masked the continuity of actual human expertise flowing beneath the changing letterheads. Same drawing boards, same design tradition, different stamps on the correspondence. Red Top sat at the apex of that tradition. In every measurable parameter, the superior weapon to the Firestreak it was designed to replace. All-aspect engagement, Mach 3. A larger, more destructive warhead. In any system that finished what it started, Red Top would have fully replaced Firestreak by the late 1960s, and the mixed loadout absurdity of the 1980s would never have occurred. Instead, the early 1980s found Britain's air defence in a posture that should have alarmed anyone paying attention. Soviet SS-20 intermediate-range nuclear missiles were deployed across Eastern Europe. NATO responded with Pershing II and cruise missile deployments, and the Cold War entered one of its tensest phases. Soviet Tu-95 Bears continued probing the edges of British airspace from Kola Peninsula bases. RAF Binbrook's Quick Reaction Alert, 5 Squadron and 11 Squadron, the last operational Lightning units, was the final tripwire. If Soviet bombers turned inbound, these pilots and these aircraft were the barrier between nuclear warheads and the British population. Half those missiles had seekers designed before British food rationing ended in 1954. The pattern Red Top's failure exemplified wasn't unique to air-to-air weapons. British defence procurement from 1957 onward produced a repeating cycle. Launch a technically brilliant programme, invest enough to demonstrate feasibility, then cancel it for political or economic reasons before it could mature, leaving the armed forces to fly ageing equipment decades past retirement. The TSR-2, a strike and reconnaissance aircraft of extraordinary ambition, was cancelled in 1965 after enormous expenditure. The Hawker Siddeley P-1154, a supersonic vertical takeoff fighter, died before it flew. The Lightning itself, declared the last manned interceptor Britain would build, went unreplaced until the Tornado F-3 arrived in the mid to late 1980s, and 5 and 11 Squadron kept flying Lightnings at Binbrook until the summer of 1988, 29 years after the type entered service. Each cancellation left gaps. Each gap was filled by extending older equipment. Each extension demanded maintenance and operational workarounds that nobody had planned for because nobody believed the equipment would still be there. Red Top's inability to fully displace Firestreak was one instance of a systemic disease, an institutional failure to commit, to fund the completion of programs already started, to make a decision and follow through. Red Top's stability problems were an engineering problem. Engineering problems get solved by engineers, given resources and time. They don't get solved by committees unable to decide whether the aircraft carrying the missile has a future. A JSTOR paper on de Havilland's missile work describes the culture that produced both weapons. The light touch of management in de Havilland Propellers missile division. A workplace that gave young scientists room to innovate and, critically, to over-engineer. Colin Hempstead and his colleagues didn't build Firestreak's Seeker to last 30 years. They built it with enough margin, enough robustness in the optics, enough reliability in every subsystem, enough brute engineering integrity, that when the institution failed to replace it on schedule, the weapons simply kept working. Successive generations of RAF armourers maintained Firestreaks long after the original designers scattered. Hempstead to a Polytechnic in Teesside, Kidd to whatever followed his time at Bedford, The unnamed guidance engineer to Texas and the dawn of the semiconductor age. The designers moved on. What they built didn't. Red Top served capably through those final decades. In every engagement scenario the RAF trained for, it was the superior weapon. Faster, more versatile, able to engage from angles Firestreak's rear hemisphere seeker couldn't reach. Every Red Top mounted on a Lightning represented what British air defence was supposed to look like. Every Firestreak mounted on the adjacent station represented the distance between what the engineers delivered and what the institution managed to deploy. When the last Lightnings stood down at Binbrook in the summer of 1988, replaced by the Tornado F3, both missiles retired together. But for 30 years, the credibility of Britain's air defence rested on the promise that these weapons would work if launched, that the seekers would lock, the warheads would detonate, and the engineering done in Hatfield and Bedford in the early 1950s would hold under conditions the designers couldn't have foreseen. It held. Colin Hempstead's infrared seeker, built on principles derived from captured German research, had still been guiding missiles toward their targets the year before the Berlin Wall fell. You can read that as the greatest compliment you could pay a physicist. Proof that one man's work outlasted 30 years of procurement failures, defence reviews, and policy reversals. Or you can read it as the most damning indictment of a system that forced a 1950s weapon to do a 1980s job because nobody could manage the replacement. Red Top was the answer. Faster, smarter, all-aspect capable. Everything the air staff asked for. De Havilland's engineers delivered exactly what was specified, and still it couldn't finish the job it was built to do, because the institution between the drawing board and the flight line wouldn't get out of its own way long enough to let it. The brilliance was real, so was the failure. And the fact that they coexisted on the belly of the same aircraft for over 2 decades tells you everything you need to know about how Britain ran its Cold War defence. If you or your family worked on these programmes, Firestreak, Red Top, the Lightning, RAE Bedford, de Havilland at Hatfield, those stories belong in the record. The accounts of engineers like Sam Kidd and Colin Hempstead survive because someone remembered and someone spoke up. There are more stories out there. Share them in the comments. Subscribe for more stories like this.